This week, we're taking a look at symbolic interaction and the self. If you recall from Introduction to Sociology, symbolic interaction is a perspective that emphasizes the subjective experiences of individuals in social situations. Meaning making is what matters to symbolic interaction. And according to theorists in this tradition, if you want to understand society, you need to understand how individuals make sense of their social situations. This week, we look at two theories that came from this tradition: identity theory and affect control theory. When you're working through the course material for these theories, I want you to pay attention to how they deal with meaning making. It's important. The question I ask in the title of the video, "What is the self?" is perhaps one of the most difficult things to understand if you're new to social psychology. When I ask the question, I'm not talking about yourself or myself, rather I'm talking about the self. I made a big deal in the last video about definitions, so I want to define the self for you. Definitions of the self are difficult though, because good definitions do not use the term that they're trying to define. But how do you do that with the self? The idea is inherently self-reflexive, and so can be confusing. I think the best way to do it is to illustrate the self in an interaction. To do that, I'm going to use Mead's ideas about group relations and interaction. So here we have a very simplified interaction. We have three individuals: Alex, Bailey, and Charlie. They can interact with one another in a social situation. By interact, really what I mean is they can direct behavior to one another. Because they're in the same situation, they can also observe the interactions of the other two. Let's focus on Alex. Alex can direct behavior towards Bailey or Charlie, and can have behaviors from Bailey or Charlie directed towards Alex. Alex can also observe the interactions of Bailey and Charlie. Alex, like most humans, is not a mindless robot rigidly executing code in response to the inputs from Bailey or Charlie. Alex can learn. Alex also has a host of preferences, things that they like or dislike. For example, Alex may like it when Bailey helps Alex with a goal, and dislike it when Bailey avoids helping Alex. So Alex can reflect on the behaviors that are directed at Alex. Because Alex can learn and reflect on the behaviors of others, Alex is able to form mental representations of other people. This idea is what Mead called the specific other. A specific other is what you think someone else is like. Specific others are mental representations of other people in your life. Have you ever done something that your mom, dad, or another important person in your life would have disliked? That pang of guilt you felt was possible because you have a mental representation of that person in your mind. Even though a specific other is not in the room actively shaming you for your actions, you can still picture how they would react to your actions, and that mental image is enough for you to feel bad, even if you know they'll never find out. The ability to hold mental representations of others in your mind's eye is what makes the self possible. But our picture of the self is not yet complete. Recall that Alex is in a social situation with two others, Bailey and Charlie. Not only can Alex form mental representations of Bailey and Charlie as individuals, they can form representations about what Bailey and Charlie are like as a group. This mental representation of a group of others is what Mead called the generalized other. Unlike a specific other, generalized others are a mental representation of what a common group member is like. For example, if you've ever worked in a supermarket, you probably have some idea about how other workers at your store would react to your behavior, even if you're not thinking of a specific person. Or if you ever played on a baseball or soccer team, you might have a mental representation of a teammate. Coworkers and teammates are both examples of generalized others. In complex societies, there are countless generalized others: coworkers, teammates, people who live in your state or region, members of particular congregations or religious groups, high school students, university students. All of these are examples of generalized others. And as I listed each group, you probably had little trouble forming a picture of what that group was like in your mind. We all have the ability to form mental representations of generalized others for groups of all different sizes, all the way up to and including a generalized other for entire societies. Have you ever thought about what Americans think or how Westerners act? Then you're thinking about a generalized other for an entire society. So through social interactions, Alex can form mental representations of specific others and mental representations of generalized others. Mead thought that this process happened early in childhood through play and interaction with other children. He also thought that this happened sequentially. First, children develop the ability to form a sense of themselves as it relates to specific others. Then, after more complex social interactions, a sense of themselves in relation to generalized others. Mead based these assumptions on his observations of children playing. He noted that young children often play by pretending to take on specific roles they observe in adult life. He gives the example of cops and robbers. Young children playing take turns taking on the role of cop or robber, roles that allow them to think of themselves in relation to a specific other. Older children engage in activity that Mead called games to distinguish it from play. Games differ from play in that they have clear rules that need to be followed. They also require coordination from all of the players. The fact that games have this structure requires all players to be able to take on not only the perspective of specific others, but the perspective of an entire group of people, a generalized other. A shortstop on the baseball diamond has to be able to think about what his teammates are going to do, what the batter or any runners on base are going to do, and how those likely behaviors relate to the rules of baseball. That's quite a bit of perspective taking. Thus, through the processes of play and game, children learn to take on the perspective of specific and generalized others. But specific others and generalized others are not the self. So what is the self? Well, Alex can form mental representations of both Bailey and Charlie, and representations of Bailey and Charlie together. Using those representations, Alex can think about how their own interaction with others will go. They may use their mental representation of Bailey to anticipate likely behaviors of Bailey in reaction to something they do. Or they may use the generalized other they've developed of Bailey and Charlie to anticipate how they will react as a group. It turns out that Alex can also form mental representations of Alex. That is the self. When Alex thinks about Alex in the same way that Alex thinks about Bailey or Charlie, or when Alex thinks about Alex as they relate to a generalized other, that process is what we mean when we say the self. The self is a process of highly socialized reflexivity. More than just a reaction to external stimuli, the self is the ability that you have to regard you in the same way that you regard other people, to form a mental representation of you in your own mind. Really think about that because it's kind of crazy. Mead thought that the self was only possible in highly socialized settings. In other words, to develop a self, we need social interaction, and importantly, we need symbolic language. Symbolic languages, which include every human language, are important to the process of developing a self because learning a symbolic language requires you to learn about abstract representation. And the ability to form abstract representations of the world is what is required to form specific and generalized others and to ultimately form a self. This set of ideas, the self, specific and generalized others, their development in humans through socialization, and the importance of symbolic language have some interesting implications. Let's look at a few. Because the self requires both symbolic language and social interactions, most animals don't have selves. This is because most animals lack symbolic language. Actually, a diehard symbolic interactionist will tell you that no animal other than human beings has symbolic language, but I think that might be overstating things a bit. There is some evidence that dolphins, for example, can communicate with symbolic language. So while there's no proof that any non-human animal has symbolic language, I don't think we should be so quick to eliminate the possibility. Regardless, many animals that humans love clearly do lack symbolic language, and that means they don't develop selves. According to Mead's view, that means that these animals are not developing mental representations of others in their mind. We treat pets as if they lead a rich inner life, but Mead would say that your pets are really just reacting to stimuli. You might be tempted to object to this. Perhaps you know a cat or a dog who seems to have a personality. The animals you're thinking of may even behave differently in the presence of different humans or other animals. My cat knows me is a common objection to this idea. But Mead would tell you that the animal is just reacting to stimuli. They have come to associate your physical presence with positive feelings, and so they feel positive about you. But they don't have an inner life in the same way that a human does. The behaviors that they produce lack symbolic meaning. Mead calls this class of behaviors gestures. So when you're away, your pet really can't reflect on who you are as a person any more than it can reflect on themselves. That ability requires the development of abstract symbols. In other words, the ability to assign meaning to a symbol. Because both the development of symbolic language and the development of specific and generalized others require social interaction, those humans who do not grow up in a society do not develop a self. We know that at a minimum, language development is severely impaired in cases of extreme isolation during childhood. People who were totally deprived of social interaction during the formative years of childhood, often because they were trapped in extremely abusive situations, are not able to develop language skills the way that most people do. If Mead is correct, then we should expect people trapped in that situation to fail to develop a self. That is, people subjected to this kind of abuse would have difficulty taking the perspectives of others and difficulty reflecting on themselves. If you think about it, the relationship between self and society makes this sort of abuse even more tragic. The self is a very social thing. People who are abused this way as children not only have to suffer through the physical trauma of abuse, but they're also deprived of a very real aspect of their humanity. Okay, so I want to leave our conversation of Mead and the self with this thought. The self is fundamentally a social thing. It cannot exist without social interaction. The self is a reflexive view of you, shaped by a history of your interactions with specific and generalized others. Specific and generalized others who are situated within a particular society. How you understand yourself really is a social process. And I think this is really interesting to think about. Mead's concept of the self connects us as individuals to the social world. The self is the part of you that represents society. The self is a part of you, but it's also a part of society. Think about that while you're thinking about the theories we're working on this week. Okay, that's all for now. I'll see you in the next video.